The letter arrived at Phineas Trask's hands already stained with his brother's blood, and the words written inside it changed the entire course of his life before he had even saddled his horse. It was the autumn of 1874, and the Texas plains were burning gold and rust beneath a sky so wide and indifferent that a man could stand in the middle of it and feel himself disappear entirely. Phineas had been working a cattle drive out of Abilene when the telegraph reached him, handed over by a boy no older than 12 who looked at the tall, weathered cowboy with wide, uncertain eyes, as though he understood somehow that the paper he carried was a grenade with the pin already pulled. His brother Callum had been shot outside a saloon in Laredo, not in a fight, not in some blaze of stupid glory, but by a stray bullet from a dispute that had nothing to do with him at all. That was the worst part, the part that sat in Phineas's chest like a coal that could not cool. Callum had been standing in exactly the wrong place at exactly the wrong time, and the universe had taken him with all the carelessness of a man swatting a fly. Phineas rode hard for 3 days to reach Laredo. He slept 2 hours each night, ate dried beef and hardtack from his saddlebag, and talked to his horse, a gray roan named Copper, more than he had ever talked to any human being in his life. He told Copper things he had never said aloud, that Callum was his only family, that their parents had been gone since the war, that without Callum the Trask name would die out in that dry Texas soil the way everything else seemed to die out there, quietly, without ceremony, without anyone watching. He reached Laredo on a Thursday afternoon to find Callum still alive, but barely, laid out on a cot in a back room of the doctor's office with his chest wrapped in bandages that had gone dark red at the center. The doctor, a tired man named Alderman with spectacles too big for his face, met Phineas at the door and shook his head with such practiced sorrow that Phineas knew immediately the shaking of that head was something the doctor had done many times before. Callum was 28 years old and still, somehow, smiling when Phineas walked into that room. That smile was the thing that nearly broke Phineas in two. "There he is," Callum said, his voice a thin reed of what it had been. "Took you long enough." "Rode 3 days straight," Phineas said. He pulled a chair to the cot and sat in it and took his brother's hand the way he would never have done if Callum had been upright and healthy, because both of them were men who did not do such things in ordinary circumstances. "Finn," Callum said, after a long pause in which the only sounds were the distant noise of Laredo going about its business and the slow, labored rhythm of his breathing, "I need you to do something. Anything. There's a woman." Callum's eyes moved to the ceiling, and a different kind of expression crossed his face, something softer and more private than pain. "Her name is Inez Carver. I met her 2 years ago in Santa Fe when I was passing through. We wrote letters for a time, but then I moved on and the letters stopped, and I have been a fool every day since." Phineas watched his brother's face. He had never seen Callum look like this. In 30 years of living alongside the man, he had seen him angry and laughing and grief-stricken and drunk, but he had never seen him look the way he looked now, talking about a woman named Inez Carver. There was a nakedness to it that was almost difficult to witness. "I need you to find her," Callum said. "Tell her I am sorry I stopped writing. Tell her I thought about her every single day I was too cowardly to pick up a pen. Callum, tell her she deserved better." His grip on Phineas's hand tightened. "Promise me, Finn, promise me you will find her and tell her." There was nothing else a man could say to his dying brother in a moment like that. There was no negotiation, no qualification, no room for reason or practicality. "I promise," Phineas said. Callum died before sunrise the following morning, quietly and without further ceremony, and Phineas sat beside him until the light came through the single window of that room and turned everything in it a pale, washed-out amber. He paid for the burial himself, stood alone at the graveside because there was no one else to stand there, and spoke whatever words he could find, which were not many but were honest. Then he went to find Inez Carver. He started in Santa Fe, which was where Callum had said he met her, and he started by asking questions in every general store, every saloon, every livery stable and boarding house he could find. Santa Fe was a city of roughly 4,000 people in 1874, which was large enough that a man could spend weeks making inquiries and still feel as though he had barely scratched the surface. The streets were a mixture of adobe and wooden storefronts, Pueblo and Spanish and Anglo influences all layered on top of each other, and the air smelled of pinon smoke and red chili and horse and the dry, mineral dust of the high desert. Most people had not heard of Inez Carver. A few people thought they might have, but their recollections were vague and ultimately unhelpful. A woman at a boarding house on the eastern edge of town told him that a Carver family had rented rooms there 2 or 3 years back, but they had left, and she did not know where they had gone. A shopkeeper in the mercantile district remembered a young woman named Inez who had bought fabric and thread from him on several occasions, and had been, in his words, uncommonly precise about what colors she wanted. That detail, the precision about colors, for some reason lodged itself in Phineas's mind and would not leave. He spent 2 weeks in Santa Fe before a man at a cantina on the south side of the plaza finally gave him something useful. This man was a freighter named Orozco who moved goods back and forth between Santa Fe and the towns further south, and he said he had moved boxes for a family called Carver a year and a half ago. They had gone, he believed, to a town called Mineral Springs, a small settlement about 140 miles to the southeast, near the base of the Sacramento Mountains. It took Phineas 5 days to reach Mineral Springs, riding through country that grew progressively more austere and beautiful as he went, the land opening up into those long, pale grasslands edged by dark mountains that could make a man feel simultaneously very small and very grateful to be alive. He camped by a creek on the 3rd night and lay on his back watching stars that were obscene in their abundance out there in the darkness away from any town, and he thought about his brother, and the woman his brother had loved, and the strange errand he was now on, carrying a dead man's apology across 300 miles of the New Mexico territory. He also thought about whether he was doing this for Callum or for himself, because the truth was that the driving and the searching and the purpose of it was the only thing standing between him and a grief so total that he could not yet look directly at it. The promise was a rope he was holding on to. He was not quite ready to let it go. Mineral Springs was smaller than he had expected, a main street of about a dozen buildings anchored by a general store, a livery, a saloon called the Dusty Rose, a small church painted white that had already begun to weather back to raw wood at the corners, and a post office that appeared to double as the telegraph office, and the barber shop based on the 3 mismatched signs hanging above its door. There were perhaps 60 or 70 people living in and around the town, plus whatever ranching families came in on weekends to resupply and gossip and drink. Phineas arrived on a Saturday afternoon in late November, and the temperature had dropped sharply from what it had been further north. He could see his breath. He could see Copper's breath. The mountains to the east had snow on their higher peaks, and the sky was the specific kind of pale, hard gray that promised more. He tied Copper to the hitching post outside the general store and went in to ask his questions again, the same questions he had been asking for 3 weeks, delivered with the same economy of language, the same weathered patience. He had gotten good at it by now, at starting the inquiry in a way that did not make people suspicious or nervous, just matter of fact, just one man looking for a family he had cause to find. The man behind the counter of the general store was barrel-chested and had the sort of face that made it impossible to guess his age anywhere between 40 and 60. He listened to Phineas's question about the Carver family, and then he scratched the back of his neck and said, "Now there is a Carver woman out on the Alamosa Road. Came here from Santa Fe about a year and a half ago, set up on a small place about 4 miles east, keeps mostly to herself. Is her first name Inez?" Phineas asked. The man thought about this. "I believe it is. Her father passed on over the summer, and since then she has been out there running the place alone. People wonder how she manages it. Phineas bought a tin of coffee and some hardtack and a paper bag of dried apricots, and thanked the man, and went back outside into the cold, clean air. He stood beside Copper for a long moment, remaking the interior geography of what he was about to do. For 3 weeks he had been focused entirely on finding this woman, and now the finding was hours away, and suddenly the prospect of it was more complicated than he had imagined. He would arrive at the homestead of a woman who did not know him, carrying words from a man she had cared about who was now dead. He would have to deliver that news. He would have to watch her receive it. He rode east on the Alamosa Road with the cold settling deeper around him as the afternoon wore on. The land out here was rougher than in town, cut through with arroyos and dotted with juniper and piñon pine, the kind of country that demanded something of the people who tried to live on it. After about 3.5 miles he saw it, a small adobe house with a pitched roof of corrugated tin, a barn in somewhat better repair than the house, a corral with 2 horses in it, a kitchen garden that had been put to bed for winter with a neat order that spoke of someone who took such things seriously. There was smoke coming from the chimney. Someone was home. He rode up to the gate slowly, not wanting to alarm anyone, and called out the way a man was supposed to do when approaching an unfamiliar homestead, especially a homestead where a woman lived alone, because in 1874 in the New Mexico Territory, an unannounced stranger at your gate could mean a great many things and very few of them were welcome. "Hello, the house," he called. "I am looking for Inez Carver. My name is Phineas Trask. I have ridden from Laredo with a message from my brother Callum." There was a silence, a long one, the kind that made a man aware of the wind and the sound of his horse shifting its weight and the distant cry of a bird somewhere over the arroyos. Then the door of the house opened. She stepped out onto the small covered porch and stood there looking at him across the 30 yards of scrubby yard that separated them. And Phineas Trask, who had ridden cattle drives from Texas to Kansas and back, who had sat in the saddle through hailstorms and river crossings, and once through a stampede that had left 3 men dead, who had never in his 31 years of life been undone by a woman simply standing still and looking at him, felt something in his chest perform a very strange action that he could not immediately name. She was tall for a woman, with dark hair pulled back beneath a wide-brimmed hat that had seen considerable weather. She wore a work dress of deep brown with an apron over it, and she was wiping her hands on the apron with the absent gesture of someone interrupted in the middle of a task. Her face was serious and watchful and very still, the way a person's face gets when they hear a name that matters to them and they are preparing themselves for what comes after it. "Callum Trask's brother," she called back, her voice carrying clearly on the cold air. "Yes, ma'am." Another pause. Then she stepped down from the porch and walked toward him across the yard, and Phineas swung down from Copper and met her at the gate, and up close she was more striking than she had appeared at a distance, with dark eyes that were currently doing the work of reading everything about him and filing it away. She was somewhere around 26 or 27, he guessed. She looked like someone who had been tested by this country and had not broken under the testing. "What has happened to him?" she said. It was not entirely a question. There was something in the way she looked at him, at the solemnity of his bearing, that had told her the outline of the answer already. Phineas took his hat off. It was the least he could do. "He was shot in Laredo," he said. 6 weeks ago. He did not survive the wound." She stood very still. The only movement was the slight lift and fall of her breath, visible in the cold air. She looked at a point somewhere to the left of Phineas's shoulder, and her jaw tightened once briefly, and then she looked back at him. "I see," she said. "He asked me to find you before he passed. He wanted me to tell you he was sorry he stopped writing, and that he thought about you every day he did not." He said. Phineas paused, because delivering these words felt like carrying something fragile across rough ground, and he wanted to get them there intact. "He said you deserved better." Something shifted in her face then, just briefly, a tightening around the eyes that was the precursor to tears, and then the conscious decision not to have them, at least not here, at least not in front of a stranger. "He was a kind man," she said quietly. "He was," Phineas agreed. They stood there in the cold wind for a moment, two people joined only by a dead man's love for one of them. And then Inez Carver looked at his horse and said, "You have ridden a long way. You can put your horse in the corral and come inside. I have a pot of beans on the fire." It was practical. It was the kind of thing a person in this country did, because this country demanded hospitality, especially in winter, especially of someone who had done a hard thing and come a long way to do it. Phineas understood this. He also understood, obscurely, that something had begun. He unsaddled Copper and put him in the corral with her two horses, a brown mare and a spotted gelding who regarded the newcomer with the mildly territorial suspicion of horses everywhere. And then he took his saddlebag and his bedroll and carried them to the porch and left the bedroll there as a signal that he intended to sleep outside in the barn and not presume on her hospitality beyond the meal. She noticed the bedroll on the porch when she let him in. She noticed it but said nothing. The inside of the house was small and warm and scrupulously neat, the kind of neatness that is not the tidiness of someone who has never made a mess, but the order of someone who has decided that, in a life that is full of things beyond their control, the arrangement of their immediate space will be one thing they govern absolutely. There was a table with two chairs, a cast-iron stove that was doing excellent work, a narrow bed in the far corner behind a curtain, shelves along one wall with dishes and jars and books, and on the wall opposite the shelves, a window that looked out east toward the mountains. On the windowsill there were 3 small clay pots with herbs growing in them. The precision about colors, he thought again, unbidden. She ladled beans into 2 bowls and cut thick slices from a round of cornbread and put everything on the table, and they sat across from each other and ate in a silence that was not uncomfortable exactly, but was full of the weight of what had just passed between them. Outside, the wind was picking up and pressing against the window glass with a thin, high sound. "How far did you ride to find me?" she asked, after a time. "Started in Santa Fe," he said, 3 weeks ago about." She absorbed this. "He told you Santa Fe. He told me your name and that he met you there. I started asking around." That must have been a considerable number of questions to ask. "I made a promise," Phineas said simply. "I intended to keep it." She looked at him across the table with those dark, measuring eyes. "Most men don't," she said, and there was no bitterness in it, just a statement of observed fact, the tone of someone who has filed many pieces of evidence over the years and arrived at a conclusion. "Most don't," he agreed. She asked him about Callum, about how he had been living these last 2 years, about what he had been doing, and Phineas told her what he knew, which was not as much as she deserved to hear, because Callum had not been in the habit of writing letters to his brother any more than he had been in the habit of writing them to her. He had been moving cattle mostly, working drives out of South Texas, drifting the way young men in this country drifted, following the work and the open land. Did he ever seem happy? She asked. Phineas thought about this honestly. He seemed like a man who was waiting for something, he said finally. I understand now what he was waiting for, and that he was too stubborn to go back and get it. She was quiet for a long moment after that. Then she said, "Will you stay the night? The temperature is going to drop badly, and your bedroll on the porch is not going to be sufficient. I was planning the barn. The barn will be cold too. There is a blanket on the settee." She gestured toward a short, battered piece of furniture near the stove that Phineas had not previously noticed. "It is not comfortable, but it is better than freezing. I don't want to impose." She stood and took the bowls to the wash basin. "Mr. Trask," she said, with her back to him, "you rode 3 weeks across the territory to keep a promise to a dead man. I think one night on a settee is not imposing." So he stayed. He slept badly, not because of the settee, which was as uncomfortable as advertised, but because the strange alchemy of grief and exhaustion and the proximity of this woman he had just met worked on him in ways he could not quiet down. He lay in the dark and listened to her breathing behind the curtain and the wind working at the roof, and he thought about how strange life was, how it bent into shapes you could not have predicted from any previous point along its length. He was gone before she woke in the morning, which was his intention, to leave without being a further imposition, to return to the road and the life that was waiting for him. He left the tin of coffee he had bought at the general store on her table, which was perhaps a presumptuous thing to do but felt right. He was 3 miles down the Alamosa Road with Mineral Springs coming into sight when he realized he had no idea what he was riding toward. The promise was kept. The errand was done. There was no cattle drive waiting for him, no job lined up, no particular place he needed to be. For 3 weeks the search had been the purpose, and now the search was finished and he was riding into an empty December morning with nothing in front of him but open land. He stopped Copper in the middle of the road. Behind him, 4 miles back, was a woman running a homestead alone, on land that was rough and demanding, with winter coming. He had seen enough of that country around her place to know that she had fences that needed repair, and a barn that needed work before the real cold hit, and wood that likely needed splitting. He turned Copper around. He rode back and came through the gate again, and she was in the yard already, carrying a bucket toward the corral, and she stopped and looked at him with an expression that was unreadable. "I left you a tin of coffee," he said, knowing that it was an insufficient explanation for why he had turned around. "I saw it," she said. "Also," he said, looking at her fence line, "that north fence is going to fall down before spring." She looked at the fence too, then she looked back at him. "Yes," she said, "it is." "I have nothing to be anywhere until the spring drives start," he said. "I know how to fix a fence." A silence between them in which the wind moved and a horse in the corral blew air through its nose, and somewhere down in the arroyos, a coyote said something brief and then was quiet. "I can pay you in meals," she said finally. "I cannot pay you in money." "Meals are sufficient," he said. So he went to work. He began with the north fence, which was indeed in a dire state, 3 sections leaning at angles that suggested they were being held upright more by habit than by any structural principle. He spent 2 days on it, digging post holes in the cold, hard ground, setting new posts, stringing wire. The work was physical and absorbing and familiar, and he was glad of it. Physical work had always been the thing he reached for when his interior world became too complicated. And right now his interior world was very complicated. She brought him lunch both days, walking out to where he was working with a cloth bundle containing cornbread and dried meat, and sometimes a piece of hard candy from the jar on her kitchen shelf. She would stay for a while and watch him work or ask questions about what he was doing or tell him things about the property that he would need to know if he was going to be useful. She told him that the east pasture had a reliable water source, but that the west side depended on an irrigation ditch that needed cleaning every fall. She told him that the spotted gelding had a hoof issue that needed watching. She told him that the nearest doctor was in Mineral Springs and was not very good but was better than nothing. All of this was practical information. She delivered it practically, but Phineas noticed that she had begun, incrementally, to look at him differently than she had on the first day. There was less of the measuring watchfulness and more of something else, something more relaxed, more present. It was the shift that happened when a person stopped assessing a stranger and started seeing a person. On the 3rd day he started on the barn, patching a section of the roof that had 3 missing boards and a gap along the east wall that the winter wind was going to find with great enthusiasm. He worked through a cold, bright morning, and she worked alongside him for part of it, handing up boards when he was on the ladder, holding things steady, working with the efficient economy of someone who had done manual labor most of her life and did not see any reason to pretend otherwise. "How did you come to be out here on your own?" he asked, while they were taking a break in the thin winter sunlight, sitting on the fence rail with mugs of coffee she had brought out from the house. She considered the question, turning the mug in her hands. "My father came west from Missouri in '68, she said. My mother had died the year before, and I think he could not bear to stay where everything reminded him of her. I was 19. I came with him because there was no reason not to." She paused. "He was a good man, but not a practical one. He had a talent for acquiring land and a limited talent for working it. When he died in July, I found that the land itself was sound, but everything on it needed work. No other family, a brother in Kansas City who has 5 children and a house barely large enough for them, and no particular desire to come west." She said this without rancor. "And before you ask, no, I have no intention of going to Kansas City to be a burden on his household." Phineas smiled at his coffee. "I wasn't going to ask. Most people do. You seem like someone who has already thought through every option and arrived at her own conclusion without requiring the assistance of other people's opinions," he said. She looked at him sideways. It was the first time she had looked at him with something that was distinctly close to amusement. "That is a very polite way to describe what my father called pig-headedness," she said. "I call it knowing your own mind," he said. The amusement stayed in her expression a moment longer, and then she slid off the fence rail and said they should get back to the roof before the light changed. He stayed through December. He told himself it was because there was too much to do before winter truly settled in, which was true. There was the irrigation ditch to clear and the barn to finish, and a section of the corral that needed relaying and enough firewood to split to fill the linta behind the house twice over. He told himself it was practical. He told himself it was what any decent man would do for a woman alone on a homestead with winter coming. He told himself a great many things that were all true and all beside the point. The actual point was that he had discovered, over the weeks of their odd arrangement, that Inez Carver was the most interesting person he had been in close proximity to in his entire life. This was not what he had expected. He had expected, in the abstract, a grieving woman he would briefly comfort with his dead brother's words and then leave. He had not expected a person with opinions about everything from the proper way to cure a side of beef, to the philosophical failings of the territorial government, to the best way to calculate a planting calendar based on the Sacramento Mountains snowmelt patterns. She had read a great deal, more than most people he knew, men or women. She had books on the shelf that she actually used, their spines cracked and their pages annotated in a small, precise hand. She had opinions about what she read that she would share in the evenings when they sat at the table after dinner, him with a mug of coffee and her with whatever mending or needlework she was working on, the stove throwing warmth across the small room, and outside the dark New Mexico winter pressing quietly against the walls. She asked him questions, too. Genuine ones, the kind that required actual thought to answer rather than the polite, surface questions that most people asked. She wanted to know what he had seen on the cattle drives, what the land was like north of Abilene, what a stampede actually felt like from the inside, whether the men he had worked with were mostly decent or mostly not. She wanted to know what he thought about things, and when he told her, she pushed back on the parts she disagreed with and agreed with genuine warmth on the parts she found true. "You are not what I expected," she said one evening, without preamble, looking up from her mending. "What did you expect?" She thought about this. "When you rode up to the gate that first day and said you were Callum's brother, I expected someone like Callum. Charming and warm and moving through the world with that quality he had of making you feel as though you were the most interesting thing he had encountered all week." "Callum was considerably more charming than I am," Phineas said. "Yes," she agreed, in a tone that was neither unkind nor flattering. "But there is something to be said for substance." He did not know exactly what to do with that, and so he looked at his coffee and said nothing, and she went back to her mending. And the stove crackled, and outside the coyotes were at it again in the arroyos, their thin voices carrying on the cold, clear air. By the end of December, he had moved his bedroll from the settee to the barn, because it had seemed the right thing to do for the sake of her reputation in a small town where people noticed everything, and he had found a way to make the barn both private and adequately warm with a small brazier he rigged from an old iron pot. He was comfortable. He was also aware, with a clarity that was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore, that he was falling in love. He resisted this conclusion with considerable energy, because the situation was complicated in ways that a decent man had to acknowledge. He had come here for Callum, in Callum's name, on Callum's errand. Callum had loved this woman. The ghost of that sat between them always, even though neither of them named it directly. To turn around and fall in love with the woman his dead brother had sent him to find felt like a violation of something, though he could not quite articulate what. He also suspected that she might have loved Callum, or something close to it, the beginnings of a love that had never been allowed to develop, and that complicated things further. He had no right to whatever she had felt for his brother. On New Year's Eve of 1874, there was a gathering at the Dusty Rose Saloon in Mineral Springs, the kind of small-town celebration that involved fiddle music and a few people dancing, and a great deal of talking and some drinking. And Inez said she would go because old Marcus Webb, who ran the general store, had specifically invited her, and he was a good man who had been quietly helpful to her since her father died, and she did not want to disappoint him. She asked Phineas if he would come with her, and the asking of it was careful and neutral, neither casual nor pointed, and he said yes. He wore his better shirt and his good hat, and he brushed copper until the roan gleamed in the lamplight, and they rode into Mineral Springs side by side on a cold, clear night with more stars overhead than any other kind of sky. The mountains to the east outlined in pale starlight like the spine of something ancient. The gathering was small and warm and loud in the way that small gatherings in small towns always are, with the noise filling the space out of proportion to the number of people making it. There was a fiddle player named Crenshaw who was genuinely gifted, and a woman playing a small pump organ that had been carried somehow all the way from Missouri and had arrived, miraculously, still in tune. People danced in the cleared space between the bar and the far wall, reels and polkas, the kind of dancing that was about community and warmth rather than romance. Phineas stood at the edge of things with a glass of whiskey. He was nursing slowly and watched Inez move through the room, talking to people, responding to Marcus Webb's enthusiastic introduction of her to various townsfolk with an ease that surprised him, until he realized that what he had taken for solitude in her was not shyness at all but simply preference. She could do this, could move in a room of people with grace and warmth. She had simply chosen, on her father's land, not to. She found him at the edge of the room midway through the evening and stood beside him for a moment, watching the dancing. "You are not dancing," she observed. "I am better at watching," he said. "That is a defensive answer." "It is an honest one," he said, "although I can dance if the situation requires it." "Does this situation require it?" He looked at her then, the way the lamplight moved in her dark eyes and the way she had let her hair down from the work braid she wore every day, and it fell past her shoulders in dark waves, and he thought that the situation required a great many things that he was not sure he was at liberty to claim. "Would you like to dance?" He asked because it was the simplest version of a more complicated question. She would. They did. Crenshaw played a waltz and they moved together in the cleared space, and she was easy to dance with, which surprised him not at all by this point because everything she did with that same quality of focused, present competence. He was more aware of her than he had been standing beside her or working beside her, because dancing required a different kind of attention, a physical attunement that was different from all the other kinds. "Callum would have danced every song," she said quietly as they moved. "Yes," Phineas said, "he would have. I think about him," she said. "I think about how I felt when your letters stopped coming, how foolish I was to just accept it. I should have written again." "You should not blame yourself for that," he said. "Callum made his own choices. They were not yours to correct." "No," she agreed, "but I think about what might have been." "So do I," he said. She looked up at him then in that direct way she had that always made him feel as though she was seeing past whatever arrangement of words he was using and looking at the thing underneath. "What do you think about?" she asked. He considered being evasive. He considered deflecting into something about Callum, something safe. But she deserved honesty, which was the only currency in this landscape that was worth anything. "About what my life would look like," he said carefully, "if I had not made a promise to my brother, if I had not ridden to find you, if I had never come through that gate." Her expression shifted. She kept dancing. Outside the music went on. "And what do you think it would look like?" she asked. "Emptier," he said. The waltz ended. They stepped apart, both of them looking at the middle distance between them where the words still hung in the air. Then Marcus Webb came over to congratulate Inez on her dancing, and the moment was covered over by the normal business of the evening, and Phineas went back to his spot at the edge of the room, and finished his whiskey, and watched the fiddle player draw music from his instrument with eyes half closed, and thought about what it meant to be 31 years old, and undone by a woman he had known for 6 weeks. They rode home in the first hour of 1875, the new year already crisp and complete above them, the stars insisting on their own indifferent permanence. They rode slowly, and they talked about nothing in particular, about the fiddle player and about Marcus Webb stories, and about the quality of the whiskey at the Dusty Rose, which was not, in Phineas's professional estimation, exceptional. She laughed at something he said about the whiskey, and the sound of it in the cold, dark night was something he wanted to put in his pocket and carry with him. At the gate she reined in, and they sat there on their horses in the dark for a moment, neither of them moving toward the house. "Phineas," she said, and it was the first time she had used his first name. She had been calling him Mr. Trask for 6 weeks, and suddenly she was saying Phineas, and the sound of it in her voice was different from anything he had experienced. "Yes," he said. "I want to be honest with you," she said. "I think you deserve that. All right. I cared for Callum," she said. "I think I could have loved him given the chance. But the chance was not given, and I have had a year and a half to make my peace with that, and I have, mostly." She paused. "What I have not made peace with, and what has been occupying a considerable amount of my interior resources these past weeks, is how I feel about you." He did not say anything. He was afraid that saying anything would interrupt her, and he needed her to continue more than he had ever needed anything. "You are not your brother," she said. "You are entirely yourself, and the self you are is someone I have come to." She stopped, started again. "I want to be sure I am not simply transferring something from one Trask to another. I think I owe it to both of us to be certain of that." "That is a fair thing to want," he said, "and I respect you enormously for naming it." "Is this something you—" She stopped again, and he realized that she was not accustomed to asking for things directly, that this act of articulating what she felt and wanted was costing her something, and the cost of it made it more valuable. "Yes," he said, before she finished the sentence, because he already knew what it was asking. "What I feel has nothing to do with Callum. Callum brought me to your gate. What happened after I came through that gate has been entirely about you." The horses stood patiently in the dark. The mountains were invisible at this hour, felt rather than seen, enormous presences at the edge of the world. "Then let us see," she said. "Let us be honest with each other and see." "That is all I would ever ask," he said. He did not kiss her that night. It was not the moment for it. The moment for it would come later, when they had done the honest thing and been careful with each other and built something that could carry the weight of a kiss without collapsing. But riding to the barn and settling copper, and lying down on his bedroll in the dark, Phineas Trask was more at peace than he had been since before the telegraph boy with his devastating piece of paper had found him in Abilene. January was hard. The cold came down off the Sacramento Mountains in earnest, and the world contracted to the work that kept them warm and fed, and the space between those two things. He drove into Mineral Springs twice for supplies, and each time he was aware of the way people looked at him, and then looked at Inez, and then looked at each other with the small, satisfied expressions of people who are watching a situation develop exactly the way they had predicted it would. Marcus Webb, in particular, had the face of a man who felt personally responsible for the outcome of things he had merely observed. In the evenings they sat at the table, and she read to him sometimes, from the books on her shelf, things he had not read, and found that he liked more than he had expected. She read him passages from a natural history of the American Southwest that she found particularly relevant to the land they were living on, and a collection of essays by a man from New England who had spent time in the West and had understood some things about it and missed others entirely, and they argued pleasantly about which things he had gotten right. She had a way of presenting a disagreement that made it feel like a conversation rather than a competition, which was rare. He told her about the cattle drives, about the men he had worked with, about a particular night outside Abilene when a lightning storm had turned the whole prairie into a light show that had both terrified and astonished him and every other man in the crew. He told her about Callum as a boy, the two of them growing up in East Texas before the war had changed everything, the years after when the country had been reconfiguring itself, and they had been two young men doing the same, figuring out who they were in a world that felt provisional and uncertain. She told him about her mother, who had died of typhoid when Inez was 18, and about the grief of it and the way it had changed her father, making him both more tender and more reckless. She told him about the months after her father died in July, the particular quality of that solitude, not the freely chosen solitude of someone who prefers their own company, but the imposed solitude of someone from whom all their people have been removed. She told him this without self-pity, and he listened to it without offering the false comfort of optimism, which was what she needed. On a Thursday afternoon in mid-January, he was in the barn working on a harness that needed new leather when she appeared in the doorway with 2 mugs of coffee, and came and sat on a hay bale and handed him one. It had become a habit, this afternoon coffee in whatever space one of them happened to be working in, an arrangement that had developed without discussion or formality, like most of the things that mattered between them. She was watching him work, and the light in the barn was the low, golden light of a winter afternoon, not warm exactly but honest, the kind of light that showed things clearly. He looked up and found her looking at him and did not look away, and she did not look away, and the thing that had been building between them for weeks was present in that barn as clearly as the smell of hay and leather. He put down the harness. He got up from his stool and crossed the barn and stood in front of her, and she looked up at him from the hay bale with an expression that was open in a way he had rarely seen in her face, all the watchfulness set aside, just the person underneath it. He kissed her slowly and with the full attention that she deserved. She kissed him back with a warmth that was not tentative at all, and her hand came up and rested on his jaw with a tenderness that he felt in places that had nothing to do with his jaw. When they separated, she looked at him for a long moment. "I have been waiting for that since New Year's Eve," she said. "I was being careful," he said. "You were being excessively careful," she said, "but I find I do not mind." They laughed, the warm, close laughter of two people who have just become something different from what they were, and outside the wind moved through the piñon pines, and the afternoon went about its long, gold business. What followed was the slow, beautiful work of falling in love openly and without disguise. They were both old enough to have some sense of themselves, what they wanted and what they would not tolerate, and this gave the thing between them a quality that Phineas had not encountered before in the briefer and less examined connections of his younger years. They disagreed about things and resolved the disagreements. They talked about the future with a careful, tentative honesty, laying out possibilities and listening to each other's responses. They worked side by side in the cold, and the work itself was companionable, the shared labor of two people making something habitable. There was the question of Callum between them, and they addressed it directly one February evening when the fire was burning well and the wind outside was full of a snow that was just beginning to stick to the yard. "I want to ask you something," Inez said, "and I want you to answer me honestly." "I always do," he said. "Do you feel that you are betraying him?" she asked. "Being here with me." He had thought about this more than she knew. He had turned it over many times in the small hours in the barn, looking for the honest answer beneath all the comfortable answers. "I did at first," he said, "and then I thought about it differently. Callum sent me to find you because he cared about you. He wanted someone to tell you that you mattered to him. What he wanted for you was for you to know that." He paused. "He didn't send me to find you and then leave you out here alone. I don't think Callum, who was a generous man even when he was a foolish one, would look at what's happened between us and call it betrayal." She was quiet for a while. "I would like to believe that," she said. "I believe it enough for both of us," he said. "At least until you can believe it yourself." She looked at the fire. "He would have liked you being here," she said finally. "He always worried about me, even in the letters. He always asked if I was all right." "He told me about you with his last strength," Phineas said quietly. "He spent it on making sure you knew you were not forgotten. That was who he was." She nodded, and the grief in her face was clean and uncomplicated, the grief of someone who has processed a loss and arrived at the place where it lives alongside the living rather than in place of it. "All right," she said. "All right." In March the weather broke and the land began its spring return, which in the Sacramento Mountain country was not the gentle green awakening of more eastern places, but a sharper, more abrupt shift. The snow on the peaks beginning to move down the arroyos as melt, the ground warming unevenly, the sage coming back to color along the arroyos. Phineas helped Inez prepare the kitchen garden for planting, turning the soil that had been sitting since fall, amending it with the compost she kept in a carefully maintained pile behind the house. She knew what she was doing in that garden. He learned from watching her. The spring also brought news from the territory that was not good. There had been conflicts to the south, disputes over land that were really disputes over the older and more fundamental question of who this country belonged to and under what terms, a question that the law answered one way, and that the Apache peoples who had lived in these mountains and valleys for generations answered differently. Phineas had ridden enough of this country to have seen both sides of that equation, and to understand that the answer the law gave was not the only legitimate answer, whatever the government in Washington believed. These conflicts were distant from mineral springs, but not so distant that they couldn't be felt. There were men moving through the territory in numbers that spring, some of them army, some of them not, and the not army ones were the kind that made Phineas instinctively watchful. One afternoon in late March, a group of 3 riders came down the Alamosa Road and stopped at the gate of Inez's place, and Phineas watched them from the barn doorway with the still, assessing attention of a man who has spent enough time in rough country to know when something wants watching. The 3 riders were asking about water, they said. Their horses needed water. This was a reasonable request, and one that no decent person could deny, even if the people making it had faces that were somewhat less than reassuring. Inez came out of the house and stood on the porch, and Phineas came out of the barn and stood at the gate. And between his standing there and the manner in which he stood there, the 3 riders took their water from the trough in the corral, thanked nobody in particular, and rode on without incident. Inez waited until they were well down the road and then said, "Do you know those men?" "No," he said, "but I know that type." "What type?" "Men who are between things," he said. "No permanent employment, not enough money, too many options for how to solve that problem, and not enough conscience to restrict them to the legitimate ones." She looked down the road after them. "I have been out here alone for 8 months," she said. "I have seen that type." "I know," he said. "I have been thinking about that." "Have you?" He looked at her. They had not talked directly about the future, about what shape the arrangement between them would take in concrete, practical terms. They had talked around it, in the way that people talk around the biggest things, because the biggest things require a certain preparation. But standing here in the March wind with 3 unsavory strangers recently departed and winter behind them and the whole season of the year ahead of them, the preparation felt complete enough. "I am not going to take up work on a cattle drive this spring," he said, "if you'll have me here." "For how long?" she said. "For as long as you want me," he said. "Permanently, if that is something you would consider." She looked at him for a long time, long enough that he had time to feel the weight of the question he had just laid down between them. "Are you asking me to marry you, Phineas Trask?" she said. "I am asking if you would be willing to consider it," he said. "I am aware that I have nothing to offer you in the way of property or money, and that I would be coming into your home rather than bringing you into mine, and I want to be clear that what I am offering is myself and the work of my hands, and whatever loyalty and steadiness I have, which I believe is considerable." She stepped down from the porch. She walked toward him across the yard in the March wind with her apron snapping around her and her eyes fully open and honest, the way they got when she had made a decision. "I am not a woman who needs to be brought somewhere," she said, stopping in front of him. "I have my own home. And the offer of a man's loyalty and steadiness and the work of his hands is worth considerably more than property in my experience." She paused. "Yes, Phineas, I would be willing to consider it." "Is that a yes?" She allowed herself a smile. "That is a qualified yes that becomes an unqualified yes when you actually ask me properly." He was not a man of grand gestures or flowery language, but he understood the moment and he looked at her with everything he felt showing plainly in his face, which was not something he did easily or often and which she could read, he knew, better than anyone had been able to read him before. "Inez Carver," he said, "will you marry me?" "Yes," she said. "I will." They were married by the minister at the small white church in Mineral Springs on the first Saturday of April, 1875, on a morning when the mountains were extraordinary in the spring light, and the sky was the deep, clear blue that this country produced about 10 times a year, and that made even the most unsentimental person stop and be grateful. The witnesses were Marcus Webb and his wife, a comfortable woman named Dorothea, who cried during the ceremony with such wholehearted emotion that her husband kept handing her his handkerchief. Inez wore a dress she had made herself from fabric ordered from Mineral Springs General Store, a deep blue-gray that suited her in a way that Phineas thought was the most beautiful thing he had seen since the stars over the territory on New Year's Eve. Her hair was up, and she had put small sprigs of early desert wildflowers in it, pale yellow and cream against the dark, and the whole effect of her standing in that little weathered church was such that Phineas had to take a very firm hold on himself to speak his vows in an intelligible manner. Her vows she spoke without any visible difficulty at all, in her clear, direct voice, looking at him throughout with an expression that was serious and warm and entirely certain. After the ceremony, Marcus Webb insisted on hosting a small dinner at his house, which Dorothea had prepared with a thoroughness that suggested she had been planning it since approximately New Year's Eve, and there were several other townspeople there, the Crenshaw fiddle player and his wife, a ranching family named Barretta who lived 10 miles south and whose youngest daughter had apparently been bringing butter to Inez every month since her father died, the doctor with his 2 big spectacles, a few others. It was a small wedding party and a large kindness, and Phineas sat at Marcus Webb's table and felt, for the first time since before the telegraph boy had found him in Abilene, that he was somewhere he belonged. They rode home in the April afternoon, with the mountains throwing long shadows east across the grassland, and Inez's hand resting in the crook of his arm where she had put it at the church and left it for the entire ride. He could feel the warmth of it through his sleeve. "Happy?" he asked when their gate came into view. She turned and looked at him with all of that considerable directness. "More than I thought I would be again," she said. "Yes." The spring of 1875 was full of work, as springs on a homestead always are, the accumulated winter deferred to-do list suddenly all coming due at once. They planted the kitchen garden, repaired the irrigation ditch on the west side, replaced the rotted boards on the corral fence, and began the larger project of improving the barn sufficiently to shelter more animals than the current 2 horses and an occasionally visiting goat that belonged technically to no one and philosophically to itself. Phineas had decided that if they were going to make this land productive, he needed to understand it better, and so he spent time in the evenings with Inez's natural history books and with the maps he had begun acquiring from the land office, learning the watershed and the soil types and the seasonal patterns of rainfall. He talked to neighboring ranchers when he drove into mineral springs, men with more years in this country who had made mistakes and learned from them, and were often willing to share what they'd learned if approached with the right combination of respect and genuine curiosity. The Barreda family, who had been quietly kind to Inez during her first difficult months alone, proved to be a source of considerable practical knowledge. Old Aurelio Barreda had been ranching this country for 20 years, and his sons and daughter had grown up in it, and knew it the way you can only know a landscape when you have been shaped by it from childhood. Aurelio took to Phineas with the particular warmth he reserved for men he judged to be serious about the land, and over several long visits in the spring and early summer, he shared things about this valley and these mountains that no book had recorded, information passed down in his family's oral tradition that was both more specific and more reliable than anything the land office surveys contained. Inez and the Barreda daughter, a young woman named Catalina who was 22, had been friends since the previous year, and this friendship deepened as the two families began to be in each other's company more regularly. Catalina was different from Inez, louder and quicker to laugh and more obviously sociable, but there was a quality they shared, a seriousness about the life they were building in this country, that made them genuinely compatible. One afternoon in June, sitting on the porch with Catalina while Phineas and Aurelio's sons were working on a shared fence line between the two properties, Inez said, "I want to tell you something that I have not told anyone else yet." Catalina put down her sewing and gave Inez her full attention, which was one of her best qualities. "I am going to have a baby," Inez said. Catalina's response was immediate and completely unguarded, the best kind of response, a sound of pure happiness that was not quite a word, and pulled Inez into an embrace before she had finished speaking. When they separated, Catalina was already crying and Inez was very close to it. When Catalina demanded, "November, I think. Are you well? Are you feeling all right?" "I am feeling somewhat relentlessly nauseated in the mornings," Inez said, "but otherwise quite well." That evening, sitting in the last of the June light on the porch, Inez told Phineas. He received it in silence for a moment that was not doubt, but was the processing of something that was bigger than the words carrying it. "November," he said. "That is my calculation, yes." He reached over and took her hand and looked at it, at the capable, work-roughened hand of a woman who built things and grew things and made things function, and he thought about the strange and winding road that had brought him here, from a dying brother's bedside to this porch in the June light, and the grief of where it had started and the fullness of where it had arrived. "Callum would have been pleased," he said quietly. "He would have been insufferable about it," she said. "He would have told everyone immediately and made every event about this baby for the next 5 months." Phineas laughed, really laughed, the kind that came from the deep place where grief and gratitude lived together, and she squeezed his hand and they sat in the fading light while the mountains changed colors behind them, going from gold to pink to the deep blue-gray of their name. The summer was long and hot and productive. The kitchen garden gave abundantly. The 2 new calves they had acquired in the spring were growing well in the east pasture with its reliable water. The property was beginning to look like what it had the potential to be, rather than what Inez's father's limited practicality had made of it, which was not a criticism of her father, but simply a fact about the different things that people are good at. As Inez grew through the summer, she did not slow down as much as Phineas worried she would. She modified what she could not safely do and found other things to do instead, and when he hovered, she pointed this out to him, with a patience that had a limit clearly visible at its far end, a limit she was gracious enough not to let him reach. He tried to moderate the hovering and succeeded unevenly. In August, a letter arrived from Inez's brother in Kansas City, responding to the one she had sent him in May telling him about her marriage. His letter was warm in the somewhat distant way of someone who cares, but cannot easily translate that caring into action, and he expressed pleasure at her happiness and some practical relief. She thought, that she had found someone to share the burden of the homestead. Phineas read the letter when she showed it to him and said nothing critical, because it was not his family to criticize. But she could see in his expression what he thought of a brother who left his sister alone in the New Mexico territory for 8 months without coming to help. "He has his own life," she said. "He does," Phineas agreed. "Not everyone is you," she said. "Not everyone rides 300 miles to keep a promise." "Some men should," he said, "for their sisters." She put the letter away and said nothing more about it, but she touched his arm as she passed him on the way to the stove, the small, habitual touch that they had developed without planning it, the vocabulary of two people who live in close proximity and have learned each other's language. September brought the first real cooling and the beginning of preparations for winter, and Phineas threw himself into them with the particular urgency of a man who has added a pregnant wife to the list of things he wants to see safely through until spring. He laid in firewood until the linta was full, and he started a second pile beside the barn. He repaired the east wall of the house that had been showing a crack since they had moved the stove to a better position. He drove to Mineral Springs and spoke at length with the doctor about what to prepare for a birth in November, and came home with a list of supplies, and the knowledge that Dorothea Webb had served as a midwife on several occasions, and was willing to serve again. Dorothea Webb came out in October to see Inez, and the two of them had a long, private conversation in the house, while Phineas found things to do in the barn, and afterward Dorothea told him on her way to her wagon that Inez was healthy and well-positioned, and that he should stop wearing a groove in the barn floor with his pacing. He had not known about the pacing. "She is a strong woman," Dorothea said kindly. "Stronger than you know, and you already think she is very strong." "I know," he said. "That does not stop me worrying." "No," Dorothea said. "I suppose it wouldn't." She patted his arm in the maternal way she had with everyone, including people twice her age, and climbed into her wagon and drove away. November arrived with a cold that was serious and purposeful, not the tentative cold of autumn, but the committed cold of a winter that knew what it was doing. The Sacramento peaks disappeared into gray cloud and came back each day wearing more white, and the winds off them carried a clarity that stripped everything back to fundamentals. The baby came on the 14th of November, 1875, on a night when the snow was falling in the way that snow falls when it means to stay. Dorothea Webb had been sleeping in the house for 3 days in advance of the event, which had been Phineas's idea, and which Inez had agreed to with a pragmatism that she expressed as, "It is good to have Dorothea here. She is sensible." Phineas spent a significant portion of that night in the kitchen, kept there by Dorothea's firm and cheerful instruction, making coffee he did not drink and listening to sounds from behind the curtain that he experienced with his entire body in ways that defied description. The snow fell outside the window. The fire burned. The lamp on the table cast its circle of warmth. He heard his son's voice before he heard anything else, the first outraged declaration of an existence that had no patience for the circumstances of its arrival, and then Dorothea's voice saying things he could not distinguish, and then a silence in which the snow and the fire had all the space in the world, and then Inez's voice, low and clear, saying, "Bring him to me." Dorothea held back the curtain for him, and he went in. She was exhausted and wonderful, propped against the pillows with her hair loose and dark around her shoulders, and a look on her face that was beyond anything he had vocabulary for, because he had never seen it before, and there was no other occasion on which a human face could produce it. She was holding the baby against her chest and looking down at him with an expression of absolute, stunned love. She looked up when Phineas came in. "Come here," she said. He sat on the edge of the narrow bed and looked at his son, who was very red and very present, and appeared to be reconsidering his initial outrage about the whole situation, eyes closed now, fist curled against his mother's chest. "He looks like you," Inez said. "God help him," Phineas said, and she laughed the low, tired, beautiful laugh of someone who has just done the hardest thing and come through it, and he put his forehead against hers for a moment because he needed to, and she let him. They named the boy Callum. It was not a decision that required long discussion. It was simply the right name, the name that connected this new beginning to the one that had made it possible, the name that acknowledged the dead without being weighed down by them. Callum Trask was born into a household that was full of purpose and warmth, and the ongoing project of two people building a life with the same attention and care that they brought to everything else they undertook together. He grew through the winter of 1875 into 1876 with the single-mindedness of the very young, putting on weight and opinions in roughly equal measure, and both his parents found in him a source of delight that surprised them both with its intensity, because neither of them had expected to be the kind of person who was reduced to helpless joy by an infant's expression of confusion about his own foot. The spring of 1876 brought with it the resumption of all the outdoor work that winter had suspended, and Phineas found himself returning to it with a different sense of it than he had had the year before. This land was no longer simply the place where a woman he loved happened to be. It was his now, in the way that land becomes yours when you have worked it through full seasons and know its moods and problems and possibilities. He had laid fences in it and turned soil in it and learned where the water ran and where it didn't, and where the sun hit first in the morning and where it left last in the evening. He added 2 more cattle to the east pasture that spring and began laying out, with Aurelio Barretta's advice, a larger working plan for the property that would take 3 or 4 years to fully realize, but that, if it worked the way they planned, would make the homestead genuinely productive rather than merely survivable. He talked through every part of it with Inez, who had things to say about all of it, and whose understanding of the land's specific patterns was, after 2 years of living on it, more nuanced than his own. In the evenings, after Callum was asleep in the cradle that Phineas had built himself out of juniper wood in the weeks before his birth, they sat at the table as they always had, and talked about the work and the plans and the things they had read, and the people in town, and the state of the territory, and the small events of the day that were small only in scale, and not in the texture of the life they composed. He had never been much of a talker before Inez, not in this way, not with someone who made talking feel like the most productive use of a person's time. He had become someone who looked forward to the conversations the way he looked forward to other pleasures, as something that was actively good rather than merely past. She had changed in the year and a half since they had married, or perhaps she had simply become more fully herself, the way people do when they feel safe enough to stop holding certain things in reserve. She laughed more easily now. She was still precise and direct, and in possession of the clearest eye for facts of anyone he had known, but there was a warmth in her that had been present from the beginning, but that now had more room to express itself. She touched him more frailly, reached for his hand in passing, put her head against his shoulder in the evenings when she was tired, all the small physical language of a woman who has decided that the person beside her is safe and worthy of ease. He told her once, in one of those evening conversations, that she had undone him completely, and she had looked up from her book and said, "Good. Good," he said. "You arrived here as a perfectly self-contained person with no particular needs and a considerable amount of well-maintained distance between yourself and the rest of the world," she said. "That distance did not serve you. Being undone was an improvement." He considered this for a moment. "Are you saying I was better before or after?" "After," she said firmly and went back to her book. He was quiet for a moment. "Inez, yes. I am very glad Callum sent me to find you." She put the book down entirely and looked at him with that open, unguarded expression that he loved most of all, the one she only had at home, only here in the lamplight with the fire burning and no audience but the walls. "So am I," she said, "every single day." The summer of 1876 was the most complicated of their time on the land, because it brought real trouble, not the passing 3 strangers on horseback variety, but the organized, territorial variety, in the form of a land dispute that involved their eastern neighbor, a man named Gideon Folk, who had come to the valley 6 months earlier and had been making known his intentions regarding several homesteads in the area that he believed could be consolidated into a single large cattle operation under his management. Folk had money, not vast quantities of it, but more than any individual homesteader in the area, and he had the kind of confidence that money and a casual relationship with legal process could produce in a man who had not yet encountered a situation that stopped him. He came to see Phineas in June, riding up to the gate with 2 men behind him in the manner of someone who has arranged his approach to communicate something. He was civil in the way that certain men are civil when they believe civility is the most effective tool, direct about what he wanted, which was to buy the Carver homestead at a price he considered fair and Phineas considered an insult. Phineas declined. Folk remained civil and said he hoped Phineas would reconsider, and Phineas said he would not, and Folk left. This exchange was followed by several months of the particular kind of territorial pressure that this era and this country was well acquainted with: fences found cut, the irrigation ditch partially blocked on 2 occasions, one of the cattle found driven into a neighbor's property in a way that could technically be described as an accident. None of it was enough to take to the law. All of it was enough to make clear what was intended. Phineas responded to none of it with violence, which was not because he was incapable of it, but because he understood that violence was what Folk wanted, a justification, an excuse to escalate. He repaired the fences and cleared the ditch and recovered the cattle, and went to Mineral Springs and spoke to the Territorial Land Office, and to Marcus Webb, and to Aurelio Barretta, and to the other homesteaders in the valley who were receiving similar attention from Folk, and he began the slow, thorough work of making the legal case for why Folk's activities constituted harassment and interference with lawful property rights. It was Inez who made the decisive move, because Inez had spent 2 years reading everything available about territorial land law in the same precise way she read everything else. And what she found was that Folk's original land claim had a documentation problem that he had apparently believed was minor, but that, properly exploited, was anything but. She wrote out her findings in the same small, annotated hand she used in all her books, and presented them to the Territorial Land Office official, who came through Mineral Springs in September of 1876 on his quarterly circuit. The official, a methodical man named Hargreaves who cared more about the integrity of his records than about any individual's property ambitions, took Inez's documentation and her analysis with a seriousness that Phineas thought was at least partly due to how completely and clearly she had laid out the case. By November, Folk's claim had been referred to the territorial court in Santa Fe, and by December, Folk himself had quietly disposed of his New Mexico holdings and moved on to somewhere else, taking his 2 men with him. The valley felt different after he was gone, quieter, more itself. "You solved it," Phineas said, the evening after the news came through. "We solved it," she said. "You solved it," he said. "I repaired fences, you read the law. The fences needed repairing," she said, "and I could not have stood my ground without knowing you were standing yours." He thought about that, about what it meant to be held up by someone, not carried but supported, the way 2 walls of a structure hold each other up by leaning into each other. He had not fully understood what that felt like before, not in his own life. "I want to tell you something," he said. "You frequently want to tell me something," she said. "It is one of the things I appreciate about you. Go ahead." "When I rode to find you," he said, "I was doing it for Callum. That was the entire reason. I had a promise to keep, and I intended to keep it, and beyond that I had no expectations whatsoever." "I know," she said. "What I did not expect," he said, "was that finding you would be the thing that found me." He paused. "I had been a man who traveled light. I didn't own much. I didn't stay anywhere long. I thought that was just who I was, the kind of person who moves through the world without leaving tracks." "You leave tracks now," she said quietly. "I leave tracks now," he agreed. You did that. This place did that. He did that. He glanced toward where Callum was sleeping in his cradle, small and present and deeply unconcerned with the significance of the moment. I came here carrying a dead man's message, and I found a whole life waiting to happen. I don't know how to account for that except to say that I am grateful in a way I do not have adequate words for. Inez looked at him for a long moment, the firelight on her face, her hands still on the mending in her lap. Then she set the mending aside and came around the table and sat beside him on the settee, the battered, uncomfortable settee where he had slept his first night in this house. And she put her head against his shoulder, and his arm went around her. And they sat like that while the fire burned and the baby slept, and the New Mexico territory went about its enormous, indifferent nighttime business outside the walls. Callum always did have good instincts, she said. He really did, Phineas said. They stayed like that a long time, not talking, not needing to. The silence between them, the kind that two people can only build over many years of knowing each other and trusting each other and choosing each other every single day they get the chance. The years that followed, the later years of the 1870s and into the 1880s, unfolded with the particular texture of lives that are genuinely lived rather than merely endured. The homestead grew and changed. The cattle herd expanded and contracted and expanded again, with the rhythms of the land and the market. There were good years and hard years and years that were both at once, which is the honest nature of ranching in country that makes no promises. In the spring of 1878, Inez had their second child, a girl they named Alina, after Inez's mother, who arrived with considerably more equanimity than her brother had managed, and made her presence known in the household immediately through the sheer force of her personality, which was evident from approximately her third week of life. She had her mother's eyes and her father's stubbornness, and she terrorized her older brother with complete success from the moment she was old enough to pursue him. And the sound of the two of them in the yard in the afternoons was the sound of a house that was full of life in the best possible way. Callum, who was 3 when Alina was born, regarded her initially with suspicion, and then with the protective authority of an older sibling who has claimed something as his own, and the two of them formed the particular alliance of children who argue constantly and are deeply devoted to each other, which was the best possible outcome. The town of Mineral Springs grew through these years, as towns in the territory were growing, new families coming in, a second general store and a schoolhouse and a proper doctor who replaced the old one with his 2 big spectacles, who retired to Santa Fe. The schoolhouse was the development that mattered most to Inez, who had been teaching Callum herself at the kitchen table, and who believed with an intensity that was one of her most characteristic features, that the quality of a person's mind was the thing that would carry them through whatever the world presented. She was involved in the school from its inception, which meant she was involved in everything from the selection of the teacher to the acquisition of books to the curriculum itself. And the school board, which consisted of Marcus Webb and 2 other men who were not unintelligent but who had not read what Inez had read, learned fairly quickly to defer to her on educational matters because she always had reasons, and the reasons were always sound. Phineas watched this and felt the same mix of pride and amusement and deep respect that he had felt since the beginning, the recognition that he had married someone who was going to be useful to the world far beyond the boundaries of their own land, someone whose intelligence and precision and genuine care for the people around her were assets that belonged, in some sense, to the community that was lucky enough to have her in it. He said something like this to her one evening, in the straightforward way he had learned to say things to her, without the hedging and qualification that he had once used as a form of self-protection. "You are a considerable person," he said. She looked up from the school committee report she was annotating. "That is a peculiar thing to say." "I mean it sincerely," he said. "Most people settle for considerably less than they are capable of. You have never done that, not in this house and not anywhere else." She was quiet for a moment. My father used to say that a person who has been given a working mind owes it to everyone around them to actually use it, she said. I thought that was good advice. It was excellent advice, he said. He was not a practical man, she said, but he was a wise one. They are different things. He agreed that they were. In 1880, Phineas made the ride to Laredo that he had been planning for a year. He went alone, because it was something he needed to do alone, and he rode the same horse, Copper, who was getting older now but still willing, and he followed the same road through the same country that he had ridden in the other direction 6 years before. He brought wildflowers from the Sacramento Mountain foothills, the small pale yellow and cream ones that Inez had worn in her hair the day they married, dried and pressed between the pages of one of her books and carefully rewrapped in cloth for the journey. He laid them on Callum's grave, which had a headstone now that Phineas had arranged and paid for the previous year through the Laredo undertaker, a plain limestone marker with Callum's name and dates and the single word kind, which was what Inez had called him on the first day, and which was true. He stood at the grave for a long time. He talked to Callum the way he had talked to Copper on that first ride, telling him things he might not have said out loud in any other circumstance. He told him about Eleanor and about the school committee and about the Barretta family and about the cattle and about the way the mountains looked in October. He told him that Inez was happy, genuinely and fully happy, the kind that is built from the inside out rather than the kind that depends on circumstances remaining favorable. She is extraordinary, he told the stone. You knew that. You knew it better than you gave yourself credit for. I am sorry you didn't get back to her in time. I am grateful you sent me. He stayed another hour, sitting on the dry grass beside the grave in the Laredo sunshine, and then he stood and put on his hat and rode north. When he got home, 4 days later, Inez was in the yard with Eleanor on her hip and Callum running in circles around them, both with the ceaseless energy of a 5-year-old who has no intention of stopping until gravity physically intervenes. She shaded her eyes when she saw him coming down the Alamosa road, and when he came through the gate she was already smiling. "How was it?" she asked. "Good," he said. "It was good." She looked at his face the way she always did, the full reading of it, and whatever she found there she received quietly. "Did you bring the flowers?" "I left them there." She nodded. She shifted Eleanor on her hip, and Eleanor grabbed at his hat immediately as he dismounted, which was Eleanor's opinion of most hats, that they were fundamentally there for her personal use. He let her have it and she put it on her head where it covered her entirely to the ears, and both of them laughed. "Come inside," Inez said. "There are beans on the stove." He followed her in, little Callum attaching himself to his leg as he walked, the familiar warmth of the house meeting him at the door. He looked around at it, the stove and the books and the window with its current set of herb pots, the table where they had sat across from each other on that first night with a dead man's grief between them and nothing else. And he thought about how a life assembles itself from the things you cannot predict, from promises made in extremity and roads taken for the right reasons and gates ridden back through when you could have ridden away. He thought about his brother, who had spent his last strength making sure someone would find this woman and tell her she was not forgotten, and who had in doing so given his brother the one thing his brother had not known to look for. The beans smelled excellent. Eleanor had found a spoon and was using it to demonstrate something to the table. Young Callum had released his father's leg in favor of the slightly more interesting project of trying to get the cat, who lived in the barn and had opinions about indoor visits, to cooperate with a plan the cat had clearly not been consulted on. Inez stood at the stove and looked at him over her shoulder. "Are you going to stand in the doorway all evening?" she said. "Or are you going to come in?" He came in. He closed the door behind him on the road and the wide country and the long years that had carried him here, and he sat down at the table that had been the table in this house long before he arrived and would be the table in this house long after, and he was exactly where he was supposed to be. "Thank you," he said. She brought 2 bowls of beans to the table and sat across from him, and raised her eyebrows slightly in the way she did when she found something worth questioning. "For beans," she said. "For everything after the beans," he said. She looked at him with her dark eyes and the expression she had, the one that was private and warm and entirely his, and she said, "The thanks go both ways, Phineas Trask. Every single day they go both ways." The spring of 1882 brought two things of note to the Trask homestead on the Alamosa Road outside Mineral Springs, New Mexico territory. The first was a third child, a boy they named Henry James Trask, arriving in May with a set of lungs that announced his opinions on the matter with considerably more volume than either of his siblings had managed, and who had his father's gray eyes and his mother's precision already visible in the careful way he examined his own hands in those first weeks of life, as though conducting an inventory. The second thing was a letter from the land office in Santa Fe, informing them that the parcel of land adjacent to their eastern fence line, approximately 40 acres of mixed grassland and juniper that had been in contested status since the Folk affair in 1876, had been officially resolved in their favor and transferred to the Trask deed. Inez had been pursuing this resolution for 4 years through the patient, thorough, completely undramatic mechanism of correct documentation and persistent correspondence, and it arrived the week after Henry James did, which Phineas considered a deeply satisfactory coincidence. 40 acres, he said, reading the letter at the table while Inez nursed the baby. 42 if the survey is accurate, she said. The survey is probably accurate, he said. Hargreaves runs a tight office. He does, she agreed. 4 years of letters, but he kept good records. Phineas set the letter down and looked at his wife and his new son and the kitchen that was bigger now than it had been, expanded 2 years ago when it became clear that a house with 2 children and eventually more was going to need additional room, and the window with its herbs, different herbs than the original 3 but the same instinct, the same attention. "We should plant those 40 acres, he said. "We should decide what they're best suited for before we plant them," she said. "Of course," he said. "Obviously." "Obviously," she agreed, and the amusement in her voice was the amusement of someone who has been having variations of this conversation for 7 years and still finds it genuinely pleasant. He was 38 years old. She was 33. Young Callum was 7, and Alina was 4, and Henry James Trask was 8 days old, and had already figured out that if he made a particular sound, his father appeared with an anxiety and attentiveness that was frankly embarrassing for a man of that size and apparent competence. The homestead was solid and growing, and their name was known in the valley with a respect that was the result of years of honest work and genuine engagement with the community they were part of. Every few months Phineas rode past the spot on the Alamosa Road where he had stopped his horse on that December morning in 1874 and looked back toward the house and made the decision to turn around. He had never told Inez exactly where on the road it was, but he always knew it when he passed it, and he always thought the same thing when he did, which was that in 38 years of life it was the most consequential decision he had ever made, and he had not known, standing there, that it was anything more than a man changing his mind about which direction to ride. He supposed that was how it was with the things that mattered most. You did not always recognize them when they were happening. You recognized them after, looking back, and the recognition was the gift, the ability to see clearly what you had come from and what it had cost and what it had made possible. He recognized all of it. He was grateful for all of it, even the parts that had been terrible, even the telegram and the 3-day ride and the death of his brother in that back room in Laredo, because without those things he would have ridden in a different direction entirely and never found the gate and never asked the questions, and never eaten the beans across the table from a woman who looked at him with her whole honest face and asked him what he thought about things. Callum had given him that. Callum had used his last remaining strength to give his brother a road to follow, and the road had led here, to this house, to this woman, to these children, to this life that was imperfect in all the ways that real lives are imperfect and more than sufficient in all the ways that matter. At the end of every day, when the work was done and the children were in their beds, and the house was quiet with the particular quality of quiet that descends on a household once the people who make the most noise in it have finally consented to sleep, he and Inez sat at the table, or on the porch if the weather permitted, which in summer it often did, and they talked or they were quiet, and the mountains were there in the dark at the edge of everything. The same mountains that had been there before any of them and would be there after, enormous and patient and enduring. On one such evening, sitting on the porch in the August heat that was cooling toward something breathable as the sun went down, she said, "Do you ever think about how different your life would be if you had ridden the other direction that morning?" He thought about the spot on the road. He thought about 38 years old and 3 children and 42 new acres and the school committee and the Barretta family and Marcus Webb's face at their wedding and the fiddle player and the stars over the territory on New Year's Eve of 1875. "I think about it sometimes," he said, "the same way I think about other roads not taken. And I am here," he said. "So the other roads were not for me." She leaned her head against his shoulder, which was what she did when she was tired and content and didn't need to say anything because the gesture said it. "No," she agreed. "They were not. The mountains were there in the dark. The stars were there above the mountains. The night was full of the sounds of the high desert, the insects and the occasional distant coyote, and the horses in the corral shifting their weight in the way of horses who are comfortable. Henry James would be up in 4 hours wanting to be fed, and then young Callum would be up before that with a question about something he had thought of in the night, because young Callum always thought of things in the night and was constitutionally incapable of waiting until morning to present them. Alina was already threatening to be up at first light, because she had plans for the morning that she had announced at dinner with the seriousness of someone who intended to be held to them. Tomorrow there was the east pasture to check, and the irrigation ditch needed cleaning again, and there was a letter to draft to the land office about the survey markers on the new 40 acres, and enough ordinary work to fill 3 ordinary days. But right now there was the porch and the mountains and the woman beside him and the stars doing what they always did, burning quietly and without ceasing above the whole vast country, the same stars that had looked down on this land for every year of human presence in it and would go on looking long after, undiminished, patient, witness to everything. Phineas Trask sat on the porch of the house on the Alamosa Road and held his wife's hand and let the night be what it was, which was enough, which was more than enough, which was everything.